The blood-red sun crept over the horizon like a wounded animal, casting long shadows across the dusty streets of Austin, Texas, as Eliza Blackburn stood frozen before the charred ruins of what had once been her family's modest ranch house. It was 1875, a time when the West was still wild and justice was often delivered from the barrel of a gun rather than the gavel of a judge. The 22-year-old woman hadn't spoken a single word in the 3 months since that terrible night. Not since she'd watched from her hiding place in the root cellar as masked men torched her home, the screams of her parents trapped inside haunting her every waking moment and chasing her through her nightmares. The local doctor called it shock melancholia, but the townsfolk of Austin had other names for it, mostly whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. Eliza wrapped her arms around herself, her slender fingers gripping the worn fabric of her faded blue dress. The early morning air carried the scent of sage and dust, mingling with the lingering smell of ash that never seemed to leave the ruins. Her honey-brown hair hung loose around her shoulders, dancing in the gentle breeze as she stood sentinel over the remnants of her former life. "Miss Blackburn." The voice came soft and low from behind her, careful not to startle. "The stage coach to your aunt's place in San Antonio leaves at noon." Sheriff Miller had been kind enough in his gruff way, but even he seemed relieved to be washing his hands of the strange, silent girl who brought discomfort to everyone she encountered. People didn't know what to do with her silence. It was like a mirror reflecting back their own helplessness, their own mortality. Eliza nodded without turning around. She had packed her meager possessions the night before: 2 dresses, her mother's silver hairbrush, and a locket containing miniature portraits of her parents. Everything else had been consumed by the flames. She took one last look at the blackened timbers, committing to memory the exact angle of the collapsed roof and the way the morning light glinted off shards of broken glass. Then she turned and walked away, her footsteps leaving small clouds of dust in her wake as she headed back toward town. Austin had grown considerably in the decades since the war, with new buildings sprouting up along Congress Avenue like determined weeds. The state capitol building stood proudly at the north end, its limestone facade gleaming in the morning light. But for all its progress, Austin was still a frontier town at heart, where cowboys and cattle barons rubbed shoulders with politicians and merchants. Eliza moved through the awakening town like a ghost, keeping her eyes downcast to avoid the pitying glances of early risers. She had an hour before she needed to be at the stagecoach office, and her feet carried her instinctively toward the small cemetery on the eastern edge of town. The graves of Jonathan and Mary Blackburn were still fresh, the turned earth darker than the surrounding soil. 2 simple wooden crosses marked their final resting place, names and dates carved by the undertaker's steady hand. Eliza knelt between them, her fingers trailing through the dirt as tears slid silently down her cheeks. She had cried often since that night, but always without sound, as if her voice had been buried along with her parents'. The doctor had assured Sheriff Miller that there was nothing physically wrong with her vocal cords. The silence was born of something deeper, a wound of the spirit rather than the flesh. Lost in her grief, she didn't hear the approaching footsteps until a shadow fell across the graves. "I'm sorry to interrupt your mourning, miss." The voice was deep and gentle, with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas roots. Eliza looked up to see a tall man standing a respectful distance away, hat in hand. His sun-bronzed face was partially obscured by a neatly trimmed beard, but his eyes were the clear blue of a summer sky. "Name's Quentin Thornton," he continued when she didn't respond. "I'm heading the same direction as your stage." Sheriff Miller asked if I'd see you safely to your aunt's place in San Antonio. Eliza rose to her feet, brushing the dirt from her skirts as she studied the stranger. He was dressed simply but well: dark trousers, a blue cotton shirt, and a leather vest that had seen better days. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the handle of his revolver worn smooth from use. His boots were scuffed but clean, and his broad-brimmed hat bore the creases and sweat stains of a man who spent most of his days outdoors. "The sheriff mentioned you've been through a terrible ordeal," Quentin said, his voice dropping even lower. "I want to assure you that I mean no harm. I'm just headed south anyway, and I gave the sheriff my word I'd see you safely delivered." Eliza's eyes narrowed slightly. She'd grown wary of strangers. Since the attack, everyone was a potential threat now. But there was something in this man's manner that didn't set off the same alarm bells that others had. Perhaps it was the way he kept his distance, or how he held his hat instead of wearing it in her presence, or maybe just the fact that he spoke to her as if expecting no response, demanding nothing of her. She gave a small nod of acknowledgement, which seemed to satisfy him. "I'll meet you at the stage office at noon, then," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "Take all the time you need here. I won't rush you." With that, he tipped his hat and walked away, his spurs making a soft, jingling sound with each step. Eliza turned back to her parents' graves, placing a hand on each of the crosses. Her lips moved in a silent goodbye, a promise to return someday, though she had no idea when that might be or what circumstances would bring her back. The stagecoach office was already bustling when Eliza arrived shortly before noon. Travelers milled about, checking bags and purchasing tickets, their voices creating a cacophony that made her want to cover her ears and retreat. Instead, she clutched her small carpet bag tighter and made her way to the counter where a harried-looking clerk was sorting through papers. "Ticket for Blackburn," she mouthed silently, pointing to her name on the manifest when the clerk looked up. "Ah, yes. Miss Blackburn to San Antonio," the clerk said, checking off her name. "Your fare's been paid by Sheriff Miller. Stage leaves in 20 minutes. You can wait outside if you like." Eliza nodded her thanks and turned to find a quiet corner away from the press of bodies. That's when she spotted Quentin Thornton leaning against the wall near the door, watching the comings and goings with the relaxed vigilance of a man accustomed to staying alert without appearing so. He straightened when he saw her, offering a small smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "All set, Miss Blackburn?" he asked, his voice pitched just for her ears despite the noise around them. Eliza nodded again, clutching her bag to her chest like a shield. "The journey takes about 2 days this time of year," he explained as they stepped outside into the bright sunlight. "Roads are decent, but we'll be stopping overnight at a way station about halfway there. The sheriff gave me the address of your aunt's place so I can make sure you arrive safely." The stagecoach was already being loaded with luggage, the driver checking the harnesses on the team of 4 horses while his assistant secured mail bags to the roof. Several passengers were already claiming seats inside the vehicle, which looked uncomfortably cramped to Eliza's eyes. "It's not the most comfortable way to travel," Quentin admitted, seeming to read her thoughts. "But it's the fastest and relatively safe these days. The Rangers have cleared out most of the bandits on this route." The mention of danger made Eliza's heart rate quicken. She'd had enough danger to last a lifetime. "I'll be riding alongside," he added, nodding toward a sturdy bay gelding tethered to a nearby post. "Got business in San Antonio that can't wait for the stage schedule, but I'll be keeping an eye out the whole way." This information seemed to ease some of the tension in Eliza's shoulders. The thought of being crammed into the stagecoach with strangers for 2 days had been weighing on her, but knowing that this soft-spoken man would be nearby outside, where he could see any approaching threats, was oddly comforting. "All aboard who's coming aboard." The driver called out, climbing up to his seat. "Stage to San Antonio leaves in 5 minutes." Quentin gestured toward the coach. "Would you like me to help you in?" Eliza shook her head and approached the stage on her own, allowing the assistant to take her hand as she climbed the metal steps. Inside, she found herself seated between an elderly woman who immediately began fanning herself against the heat, and a portly businessman who smelled faintly of tobacco and hair pomade. As the stage coach lurched into motion, Eliza caught a glimpse of Quentin Thornton mounting his horse and falling into place alongside the coach. He looked up, meeting her eyes through the window, and touched the brim of his hat in a reassuring gesture before turning his attention to the road ahead. The journey south from Austin was arduous, despite the relatively well-maintained road. The stage coach bounced and swayed over every rut and stone, and the close quarters meant that Eliza was constantly touching shoulders or knees with her fellow passengers, an experience that made her skin crawl after months of avoiding human contact. The elderly woman beside her, who had introduced herself as Mrs. Henderson from Dallas, seemed determined to fill the silence with a steady stream of conversation, most of it not requiring any response. This suited Eliza fine, allowing her to retreat into her thoughts while nodding occasionally to indicate she was still listening. "Such a terrible business with your family, dear Mrs. Henderson said during a brief lull in her monologue, lowering her voice to what she clearly thought was a discreet level, but was perfectly audible to everyone in the coach. "Sheriff Miller told my nephew all about it when I was arranging my ticket. Horrible, just horrible. But you'll be safe with your aunt now, and they say time heals all wounds, don't they?" Eliza stiffened, her eyes fixed on the passing landscape outside the window. Her silence seemed to make Mrs. Henderson uncomfortable, as it did most people, and the woman soon returned to safer topics: the unseasonable heat, her troublesome rheumatism, and her nephew's thriving hardware business in Austin. Every hour or so, the stage coach would stop briefly to change horses or allow passengers to stretch their legs. During these stops, Eliza noticed that Quentin Thornton maintained a respectful distance, but always kept her in his sight. He didn't hover or intrude, yet she felt his watchful presence like a protective cloak around her shoulders. At midday, they stopped at a small way station for a quick meal. While the other passengers crowded around the long table inside, laughing and talking over bowls of bean stew and plates of cornbread, Eliza took her portion and retreated to the shade of a cottonwood tree beside the building. She had just settled on a flat rock when she sensed someone approaching. Looking up, she saw Quentin walking toward her, his own plate in hand. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Gets mighty loud in there." Eliza hesitated, then nodded slightly, moving over to make room on the large rock. He sat down, leaving enough space between them that she didn't feel crowded. "I prefer eating outside anyway," he said conversationally, as he broke off a piece of cornbread. "Spent too many years under the open sky to feel comfortable with a roof over my head for too long." He didn't seem bothered by her silence, continuing to eat quietly and occasionally commenting on something innocuous: the quality of the food, the weather, a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. His voice was low and soothing, the cadence almost musical in its gentle rhythm. "Been working as a ranch foreman down near San Antonio for about 5 years now," he told her as they finished their meal. "Before that, I drove cattle up the Kishome Trail a few times. Hard work, but there's something to be said for seeing new country, meeting different folks." He glanced at her, his blue eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. I reckon everyone's got their own story. Some are just harder to tell than others." There was no pressure in his words, no expectation, just a simple acknowledgement of her silence without judgment or pity. For the first time since the attack, Eliza felt something other than grief or fear. A tiny flicker of curiosity about this man who spoke so gently and watched so carefully. The respite was short-lived, however, as the driver called for everyone to reboard. The afternoon stretched on much like the morning had, with dust and heat and the endless rocking motion of the coach. By the time they reached the overnight stop, a larger way station with basic sleeping accommodations, Eliza's head was pounding, and her nerves felt raw from the constant proximity to strangers. The way station was a sprawling adobe structure with a central courtyard, offering simple but clean rooms for travelers. Eliza was shown to a small chamber with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small window overlooking the stables. After the crowded stagecoach, the solitude was a blessed relief. She had just finished washing the dust from her face when a soft knock came at her door. Opening it cautiously, she found a young Mexican woman holding a tray with a covered plate and a cup of tea. "Senor Thornton asked that you be brought dinner," the woman explained with a kind smile. "He said you might prefer to eat in private." Surprised and touched by the thoughtful gesture, Eliza accepted the tray with a grateful nod. The woman, who introduced herself as Maria, seemed unfazed by Eliza's silence, chattering amiably as she lit the lamp and turned down the bed. "If you need anything else, just ring the bell by your door," Maria said as she prepared to leave. "Oh, and Senor Thornton asked me to tell you that he will be patrolling the grounds tonight, so you need not worry about your safety." After Maria left, Eliza sat on the edge of her bed, contemplating the covered plate. It was a small kindness, but one that demonstrated an unusual level of perception. Quentin Thornton had somehow understood that the prospect of another meal surrounded by strangers would be almost unbearable after the long day of forced proximity. She ate slowly, savoring the simple but flavorful stew and fresh bread. When she finished, she placed the tray outside her door as Maria had instructed, then returned to sit by the window. The night was clear, stars scattered across the velvet black sky like diamonds on a jeweler's cloth. In the courtyard below, she could see Quentin's tall figure making a slow circuit of the property, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. For reasons she couldn't quite articulate, the sight of him standing guard eased something tight in her chest, allowing her to finally lie down and drift into a dreamless sleep, the first she'd had in months. The second day of travel dawned clear and hot, promising another dusty journey. Eliza had just finished pinning up her hair when there was another knock at her door. This time, it was Quentin himself, his hat in his hands and his expression apologetic. "Pardon the intrusion, Miss Blackburn," he said, keeping his voice low. "I wanted to warn you that we've had word of some trouble ahead. Nothing too serious, just some local troublemakers who have been harassing travelers about 20 miles south of here." Eliza's eyes widened in alarm, her fingers tightening on the doorframe. "Now, don't you worry," he hastened to add, clearly reading her fear. "The stage will be continuing on schedule, but I've sent word ahead to the rangers. They'll meet us at Comanche Creek to escort the coach the rest of the way." He paused, studying her pale face. "I'll be riding closer to the coach today. Nobody's going to harm you or any of the other passengers, Miss Blackburn. You have my word on that." There was something solid and reassuring in his promise, not bravado or empty words, but the quiet confidence of a man who knew his capabilities. Eliza found herself believing him despite her fears. She nodded slowly, and he seemed to relax slightly. "We leave in half an hour," he said, settling his hat back on his head. I've asked Maria to bring you some breakfast you can take with you." True to his word, Quentin stayed close to the stagecoach as they set out, sometimes riding alongside, sometimes ranging ahead to scout the road. The other passengers had been informed of the potential danger, creating a tense atmosphere inside the coach. Even Mrs. Henderson's usual chatter was subdued, replaced by nervous glances out the windows. They had been traveling for perhaps 3 hours when the driver suddenly reined in the horses, bringing the coach to an abrupt halt that threw the passengers forward in their seats. Eliza's heart began to pound as she heard men's voices outside, followed by Quentin's deeper tones responding to them. The businessman across from her peered out the window. "3 men blocking the road," he reported in a hushed voice. "Rough-looking characters. But your cowboy friend is talking to them." Eliza leaned toward her own window, straining to hear the exchange. Quentin sat easily in his saddle, one hand resting casually on his thigh, close to his holstered revolver. His posture seemed relaxed, but Eliza could see the alertness in his eyes, the readiness in the set of his shoulders. "Roads open to all travelers," he was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "We're just passing through. No need for any unpleasantness." One of the men, a wiry fellow with a scraggly beard, spat into the dust. "Toll road now," he drawled. $10 a passenger, or you turn around and go back the way you came." "Now that's interesting," Quentin replied, still maintaining that casual tone. "Because I've traveled this road many times and I don't recall any toll being authorized by the county." "We're the authority here," another man said, patting the rifle resting across his saddle. Quentin nodded thoughtfully. "Well, that puts us in a difficult position. You see, I gave my word to deliver these passengers safely to San Antonio, and I'm not in the habit of breaking my word." The tension stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. Eliza held her breath, her fingers digging into the worn leather of the seat. "3 of you, 7 of us counting the passengers," Quentin continued conversationally. "Not favorable odds for you boys, and I should mention that I sent word ahead to the rangers about troublemakers on this stretch of road. They're expecting us at Comanche Creek in about an hour. If we don't show—" He shrugged eloquently. The men exchanged uncertain glances, clearly reassessing the situation. "Now, I'm guessing you fellas aren't really looking for serious trouble," Quentin went on, his voice taking on a harder edge despite its soft volume. "Harassing travelers is one thing. Facing murder charges and a ranger's posse is quite another." A tense silence followed his words. Then, with a muttered curse, the leader of the 3 men jerked his head to the side. "Come on, boys. Ain't worth the trouble." They backed their horses off the road, glaring sullenly as the stagecoach rolled past. Quentin remained between them and the coach, his hand still near his gun, until the would-be robbers were well behind them. Only then did he ride up alongside Eliza's window, the tension gradually easing from his features. "Sorry about that, folks," he called to the passengers. "Shouldn't have any more trouble now. Rangers will meet us ahead as planned." The relief inside the coach was palpable, with several passengers offering prayers of thanks or commenting on Quentin's cool handling of the situation. Eliza simply watched him through the window, studying the way the sun caught in his hair and the easy grace with which he handled his horse. When he caught her looking, he gave her a small, reassuring smile, not the cocky grin of a man showing off, but the gentle expression of someone who understood her fear and wanted to ease it. She found herself offering a tiny smile in return, the first to cross her lips since the night of the fire. If Quentin noticed the milestone, he gave no indication, simply touching the brim of his hat before returning his attention to the road ahead. But something had shifted in Eliza's, chest a small but significant cracking of the ice that had encased her heart. The rest of the journey passed without incident. True to Quentin's word, 2 Texas Rangers met them at Comanche Creek, falling in to escort the stage the remaining distance to San Antonio. By the time they rolled into the city late that afternoon, the initial fear had faded, leaving behind a strange mixture of exhaustion and something almost like disappointment that the journey was ending. San Antonio was larger and more bustling than Austin, with a distinctive character shaped by its Spanish origins and diverse population. The stagecoach pulled up before the central station, where passengers began gathering their belongings and saying their farewells. Eliza stepped down from the coach on legs stiff from travel, blinking in the late afternoon sunlight. Quentin was already there, having dismounted to speak with the rangers who had accompanied them. He turned as she descended, moving forward to steady her when she swayed slightly from fatigue. "Easy there," he said, his hand a light pressure on her elbow. "Long journey." She nodded, finding herself reluctant to step away from the brief contact. There was something solid and real about Quentin Thornton, something that had cut through the fog of grief and fear that had enveloped her for months. "Your aunt's place isn't far," he told her, releasing her arm once she was stable. "I can walk you there, make sure you arrive safely." Eliza nodded again, reaching for her carpet bag, but he was already lifting it along with his own saddlebag. She followed him through the busy streets, staying close to avoid being separated in the crowd. San Antonio was a city of contrasts, with elegant stone buildings standing alongside adobe structures that reflected its Mexican heritage. The sounds of English and Spanish mingled in the air, along with the sense of cooking food and livestock. Aunt Beatrice's home was in one of the newer neighborhoods, a modest but well-maintained wooden house with a small garden out front. Quentin paused at the gate, suddenly seeming unsure of himself. "Well, Miss Blackburn," he said, handing her the carpet bag, "I've delivered you as promised. I hope you find some peace here with your family." Eliza took the bag, her fingers brushing against his in the exchange. She looked up at him, wishing suddenly and fiercely that she could thank him properly, not just for the safe passage, but for the small kindnesses along the way, for treating her silence with dignity instead of pity. As if understanding her thoughts, he smiled, the expression warming his eyes. "It was my honor, miss, truly." He tipped his hat and turned to go, leading his horse back toward the main road. Eliza watched him for a long moment, a strange emptiness opening up inside her at the thought of never seeing him again. Then, gathering her courage, she hurried up the path to her aunt's door. Beatrice Holloway was a stern-faced woman in her 50s who had never married, dedicating her life instead to teaching at the local school. She greeted her niece with awkward formality, having been informed of Eliza's condition in the letter from Sheriff Miller. "I have prepared the back bedroom for you," she said, leading Eliza through the tidy house. "I keep regular hours here, breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, supper at 6 in the evening. I expect punctuality." She paused, glancing back at Eliza. "The doctor in Austin suggested that routine might help with your situation." Eliza nodded dutifully, already feeling the weight of her aunt's expectations pressing down on her. The bedroom was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a small writing desk beneath the window. It had the impersonal feeling of a room that was rarely used, lacking any of the small touches that made a space feel like home. "I'll leave you to get settled," Aunt Beatrice said, her voice softening slightly. "Supper will be ready in an hour." Left alone, Eliza sank onto the edge of the bed, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. She had traded one form of isolation for another, it seemed. Her aunt clearly meant well, but the rigid household promised little of the comfort or understanding she craved. As she unpacked her meager belongings, Eliza found herself thinking of Quentin Thornton, of his gentle voice and watchful eyes, of how he had stood between her and danger without hesitation. She wondered where he was staying in San Antonio, how long his business would keep him there, whether she might glimpse him again before he returned to his ranch. Such thoughts were foolish, she knew. He had been doing his duty, nothing more. Once he had delivered her safely, his obligation was fulfilled. She was just another job completed, another promise kept. Yet as she placed her mother's silver hairbrush on the dresser, Eliza couldn't help but wonder if perhaps, in some small way, she had made an impression on him too. The days at Aunt Beatrice's house fell into a predictable pattern. Eliza rose early each morning, helped with the household chores, accompanied her aunt to the market, and spent the afternoons either reading from her aunt's modest library or working on mending and needlepoint. Beatrice, for her part, seemed to have accepted her niece's silence as a permanent condition, speaking to her only when necessary and generally treating her more like a boarder than family. A week after her arrival, Eliza was returning from the market alone, Beatrice having trusted her to complete the simple errand, when she heard a familiar voice call out behind her, "Miss Blackburn." She turned to see Quentin Thornton approaching, looking much the same as he had during their journey except for a fresh haircut that accentuated the strong line of his jaw. He removed his hat as he reached her, a genuine smile lighting his features. "I thought that was you," he said. "How are you settling in with your aunt?" Eliza gave a small shrug, her eyes conveying what her voice could not. "Well enough, but not wonderfully." He nodded as if she had spoken aloud. "Takes time to adjust to a new place. I remember when I first came to Texas from Tennessee, as a boy felt like I'd landed on the moon." They stood awkwardly for a moment, Eliza shifting her basket of vegetables from one arm to the other. I'm staying in town a bit longer than expected," Quentin said, running a hand through his hair. "The ranch owner I work for is negotiating a big cattle sale. Looks like I'll be here at least another week." Eliza nodded, unsure what response was expected of her but pleased by the news nonetheless. "I was wondering," he continued, his usual confidence faltering slightly, "if you might like to take a walk sometime. San Antonio has some pretty spots and fresh air does a body good." The invitation surprised her, warmth blooming in her chest at the realization that he had sought her out deliberately. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Tomorrow afternoon, perhaps, say around 3 o'clock. I could meet you at your aunt's place, if that's all right." Another nod, more definite this time. "Well then," he said, settling his hat back on his head with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I look forward to it, Miss Blackburn." Eliza watched him walk away, her heart beating a little faster than usual. For the first time since arriving in San Antonio, she felt a flutter of anticipation for the day to come. Aunt Beatrice was less enthusiastic when Eliza communicated Quentin's invitation through gestures and written notes. "A cowboy," she said with a disapproving frown. "Really, Eliza, I don't think your parents would approve of such an acquaintance. They raised you to associate with a better class of people." Eliza's eyes flashed with a sudden anger that surprised them both. She grabbed the pencil and paper she kept handy and wrote quickly, "He protected me on the journey here. He is a good man." Beatrice sighed, relenting slightly at her niece's rare display of emotion. "Very well. But I expect you back by supper time and you'll stay in public areas only. Your reputation is fragile enough already. What with your condition?" The next day, Eliza spent extra time with her appearance, washing her hair with rosemary-scented water and choosing her best dress, a modest blue cotton with white trim that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. She had just finished pinning her hair when a knock came at the front door precisely at 3 o'clock. Quentin stood on the porch, hat in hand, wearing a clean shirt and his best vest. He had even polished his boots, she noticed with a small surge of pleasure. He still wore his gun belt. Few men ventured out without protection, especially in a city where strangers mingled freely, but otherwise looked more like a gentleman caller than a working cowboy. "Miss Blackburn," he greeted her with a warm smile. "You look lovely." Eliza felt a blush rise to her cheeks as she stepped outside, pointedly closing the door before Aunt Beatrice could interrogate him further. "I thought we might walk down to the river," Quentin suggested, as they set off down the street. "There's a nice path along the banks, and it's pretty this time of year with the wildflowers blooming." The San Antonio River wound through the heart of the city, its banks lined with cypress and oak trees that provided welcome shade from the afternoon sun. As they walked, Quentin maintained a gentle stream of conversation, telling her about his work at the ranch, his earlier days as a trail driver, and his dreams of someday having a small spread of his own. "Just enough land for a decent herd and a comfortable house," he said as they paused to watch a family of ducks paddling upstream. "Nothing fancy, but something to call my own." He glanced at her, a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. "My pa was a sharecropper back in Tennessee. Never owned so much as a square foot of land his whole life. I guess that's why it means so much to me, the idea of having a place where I belong." Eliza nodded, understanding all too well the desire for belonging. Since the fire, she had felt adrift, rootless, a stranger even to herself sometimes. As if reading her thoughts, Quentin's voice softened. "Sheriff Miller told me a bit about what happened to your family. I'm truly sorry for your loss, Miss Blackburn." She looked away, tears pricking at her eyes. No one had spoken so directly about her parents since she'd arrived in San Antonio. Aunt Beatrice avoided the subject entirely, as if grief were a contagious disease that might spread if acknowledged. "I lost my mother when I was 15, Quentin continued quietly. "Typhoid fever took her in less than a week. My pa followed her to the grave not 2 years later. For a long time, I couldn't talk about either of them without feeling like my chest was being crushed." He paused, skimming a flat stone across the river's surface. "I'm not saying I understand exactly what you've been through. Nobody can know another person's grief. But I do know what it's like to have the ground fall out from under you, to wake up each morning with that moment of forgetting followed by the rush of remembering." Eliza stared at him, startled by how perfectly he had articulated her daily experience. Each morning brought that cruel instant of normalcy before reality crashed back, the brief respite making the pain that followed even sharper. "Time doesn't really heal all wounds like people say," he went on, his gaze still on the river. "But it does change them, make them bearable somehow. At least, that's been my experience." He turned to her then, his expression earnest. "I want you to know, Miss Blackburn, that your silence doesn't make me uncomfortable. You communicate plenty without words if a person pays attention." The simple acceptance in his statement unlocked something in Eliza's chest, a door she hadn't realized was still capable of opening. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm lightly, trying to convey her gratitude. He smiled, covering her hand with his own for just a moment before they continued walking. The gesture was brief but significant, the first time she had initiated contact with another person since the attack. They settled into a comfortable pattern over the following days. Each afternoon, Quentin would arrive at Aunt Beatrice's house precisely at 3, hat in hand and a smile warming his features when Eliza appeared. They explored different parts of San Antonio together: the old Spanish missions, the bustling market plaza, the quiet gardens near the governor's residence. Sometimes they simply walked along the river, Quentin talking softly about his day or sharing stories from his past, while Eliza listened, occasionally responding with gestures or expressions that he seemed increasingly adept at interpreting. On the fourth day of their acquaintance, as they sat on a bench watching boats navigate the gentle current of the river, Quentin hesitantly broached a new subject. "I've been thinking, Miss Blackburn," he began, turning his hat in his hands. "My business here will be concluded soon, and I'll need to return to the ranch. It's about 30 miles west of here, a good-sized operation called the Triple Creek." Eliza felt her heart sink at the reminder that their time together was limited. "The thing is," he continued, "the owner, Mr. Hammond, is looking for someone to help his wife with the household. Their previous housekeeper left to get married last month, and Mrs. Hammond has been struggling to manage everything on her own." He glanced at her, gauging her reaction. "It would be a respectable position with your own room in the main house, fair wages, and only light duties. The Hammonds are good people. He's stern but fair, and she's one of the kindest women I've met." Eliza tilted her head, considering the unexpected proposal. "I know your aunt has taken you in out of family duty," Quentin said carefully, "but I can't help noticing that you don't seem happy there, and I thought perhaps a change of scenery, some useful work, might be beneficial." He hastened to add, "Of course, I understand if you prefer to stay here with your family. It was just a thought." Eliza sat quietly for a long moment, turning the idea over in her mind. Aunt Beatrice had done her duty in providing a home, but there was little warmth or understanding between them. The thought of working at the ranch, of being near Quentin, of having purpose again, was undeniably appealing. She looked up at him and nodded slowly, a small smile lifting the corners of her mouth. "You'll consider it?" he asked, his expression brightening. Another nod, more definite this time. "I'll speak to the Hammonds tomorrow," he promised. "If they agree, would you like me to approach your aunt about the matter?" Eliza shook her head, reaching for the small notebook and pencil she had taken to carrying. She wrote quickly, "I will tell her tonight." "All right," Quentin agreed. "Let me know what she says, and I'll make the arrangements if she approves." That evening, Eliza presented her aunt with a carefully written note explaining the opportunity and her desire to accept it. Beatrice read it with pursed lips, her expression growing increasingly disapproving. "A ranch with cowboys and cattle and who knows what sort of rough characters," she said when she finished reading. "Absolutely not. It's entirely inappropriate for a young woman of your upbringing, especially in your delicate condition." Eliza's jaw set stubbornly as she wrote another note. "I am not delicate. I need useful work and fresh air, not sitting in this house day after day." "Your parents entrusted you to my care," Beatrice countered. "I cannot in good conscience allow you to take a position that might expose you to danger or impropriety." More writing. "Mr. Thornton says the owners are respectable people. I would be living in the main house, not a bunkhouse, and I would be paid a fair wage." Beatrice sighed, removing her spectacles to pinch the bridge of her nose. "This is about that cowboy, isn't it? Eliza, you barely know the man. He could be filling your head with all sorts of nonsense." Eliza's cheeks flushed with anger as she wrote her response. "He is a good man who has shown me nothing but kindness and respect. I trust him." "Trust is easily misplaced when one is vulnerable," Beatrice said, her voice gentling slightly. "I know you've been through a terrible ordeal, dear, but making hasty decisions based on emotional attachments rarely ends well." Eliza stared at her aunt, frustrated tears pricking at her eyes. Then, with deliberate movements, she wrote one final note. I am 22 years old. My parents are gone. I need to make my own way now. I am going to accept this position with or without your blessing. Beatrice read the note, her expression shifting from surprise to resignation. I see you've made up your mind, she said finally. I cannot stop you, of course. But I would ask that you at least allow me to write to these Hammonds to satisfy myself as to their character before you depart. It was a reasonable compromise, and Eliza nodded her agreement, relief washing through her. She had won her first battle for independence since the attack, a small victory, perhaps, but significant nonetheless. The next day, she met Quentin at their usual time, eagerly sharing the news of her aunt's conditional approval. His face lit up with genuine pleasure. "That's wonderful news, Miss Blackburn," he said warmly. "I spoke with the Hammonds this morning, and they're quite interested in meeting you. Mrs. Hammond especially was pleased at the prospect of having help with the household." He hesitated, then added more softly, "And I confess I'm pleased at the thought of not having to say goodbye to you just yet." Eliza ducked her head, unable to hide the blush that rose to her cheeks or the smile that tugged at her lips. She had grown increasingly comfortable in Quentin's presence, finding in his gentle manner and watchful care a sense of safety she had thought lost forever. Over the next few days, arrangements were made for Eliza's new position. Aunt Beatrice received a detailed letter from Mrs. Hammond outlining the duties and accommodations, along with references from the local pastor and doctor attesting to the family's good standing. Satisfied, if not entirely happy about the situation, Beatrice finally gave her blessing. "Mr. Thornton has offered to escort me to the ranch on Saturday," Eliza wrote in her final note to her aunt. "I will write to you regularly to let you know how I am faring." Beatrice nodded stiffly, her expression softening just a fraction. "See that you do. And remember that you always have a place here if things don't work out as you hope." It wasn't a warm farewell, but it was sincere in its way. Eliza embraced her aunt briefly before climbing into the wagon where Quentin waited, her small trunk secured in the back alongside his own belongings. The journey to Triple Creek Ranch took most of the day, winding through rolling hills that gradually gave way to more open country. Quentin pointed out landmarks as they traveled, telling her about the local geography and the history of the area. "The Hammonds have held this land for nearly 20 years, he explained as they approached a long, shallow valley bisected by a winding stream. Started with just a small herd and a one-room cabin, built it up into one of the most prosperous spreads in the county." Eliza watched the landscape unfold with growing interest. After months of grief and confinement, the vast openness of the Texas countryside felt liberating. The April air was filled with the scent of wildflowers and new growth. Herds of cattle dotted the distant hillsides, and a hawk circled lazily overhead. As the wagon crested a final rise, Triple Creek Ranch came into view below them. The main house was a substantial two-story structure built of local limestone, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Several outbuildings clustered nearby: a barn, bunkhouse, cookhouse, and various sheds and pens. It was larger and more established-looking than Eliza had expected, clearly the home of successful and forward-thinking ranchers. "There she is," Quentin said with evident pride. "Not the biggest ranch in Texas, but one of the best run, in my opinion." They were met in the yard by Robert Hammond, a barrel-chested man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Despite his imposing appearance, he greeted Eliza with courteous respect. "Welcome to Triple Creek, Miss Blackburn," he said, helping her down from the wagon. "My wife is looking forward to meeting you. Thornton here has spoken very highly of you." Before Eliza could wonder what exactly Quentin had told his employer about her, the front door of the house opened to reveal a plump, cheerful-looking woman with kind eyes and prematurely silver hair. "There you are at last," she called, hurrying down the steps. "I'm Margaret Hammond, my dear. Come inside and rest after your journey. You must be exhausted." Margaret Hammond proved to be as warm and motherly as her appearance suggested. She showed Eliza to a pleasant room on the second floor of the house, gave her time to wash away the dust of travel, then insisted on serving her tea and fresh baked bread in the kitchen while explaining the household routines. "It's nothing too strenuous," she assured Eliza. "Mostly helping with meals, laundry, cleaning, and such. We have a cook who handles most of the food for the ranch hands, but I prefer to manage the main house kitchen myself." She paused, studying Eliza's face with gentle concern. "Quentin explained about your voice, dear. Please don't worry about it. We'll manage just fine, and there's no need to strain yourself trying to speak before you're ready." The simple acceptance in her tone brought unexpected tears to Eliza's eyes. Mrs. Hammond tactfully busied herself with the teapot, allowing Eliza a moment to compose herself. "Now," she continued when Eliza had wiped her eyes, "you'll have Sundays to yourself, and Saturday afternoons as well unless we're exceptionally busy. Your meals will be taken with us, and you'll receive $15 a month, which I think you'll find is quite fair for the work required." Eliza nodded, reaching for her notebook to express her gratitude, but Mrs. Hammond waved it away with a smile. "No need for that now, dear. We can talk more tomorrow after you've rested. Quentin will show you around the ranch when you're settled in." Life at Triple Creek quickly fell into a comfortable rhythm. Eliza rose early each morning to help Mrs. Hammond prepare breakfast, then spent the day engaged in various household tasks, beating rugs, polishing silver, mending linens, or preserving fruits and vegetables from the kitchen garden. The work was satisfying in its tangible results, giving her a sense of purpose she had lacked since the attack. In the evenings, after the day's duties were complete, she often sat on the back porch watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and crimson. Sometimes Quentin would join her after finishing his own work, sitting quietly beside her or telling her about his day in that gentle voice that had become a source of comfort. As the days passed, Eliza began to notice subtle changes in herself. The crushing weight of grief still pressed on her heart, but it no longer consumed her every waking moment. She found small pleasures again in the song of a mockingbird outside her window, in the satisfaction of a well-ironed tablecloth, in the gentle Texas breeze carrying the scent of sage and cattle and open spaces, and increasingly in Quentin's company. He was careful never to push or pressure her, maintaining a respectful distance while making it clear through 100 small gestures that he valued her presence. He brought her wildflowers he found while checking the fence lines, carved a small wooden box for her hairpins during evening hours in the bunkhouse, and always made time to walk with her on Sunday afternoons when she was free from her duties. A month after her arrival at Triple Creek, Quentin found her in the kitchen garden one warm afternoon, gathering herbs for the evening meal. He approached with his hat in his hands, a habit he maintained whenever speaking with her. "Miss Blackburn," he began, then smiled self-consciously. "Eliza, I was wondering if you might like to ride out with me tomorrow afternoon. There's a pretty spot by the North Creek I'd like to show you. Good fishing there, and some nice shade trees. Mrs. Hammond has given her permission, if you're agreeable." Eliza looked up from her basket of herbs, surprised by the invitation but pleased. She nodded, a smile lighting her features. "Wonderful," he said, returning her smile with one of his own. "I'll saddle a gentle mare for you. Do you ride much?" She shook her head slightly, then held her hand out flat and wobbled it in a so-so gesture. "Some experience, then," he interpreted correctly. "Don't worry, Blue Bell is as steady as they come. We won't go far and we'll take it slow." The following afternoon found them riding side by side along a well-worn trail that followed the largest of the 3 creeks that gave the ranch its name. Eliza sat somewhat nervously on Blue Bell, a placid gray mare that seemed content to amble along at an easy walk. Quentin rode his own horse, a spirited bay gelding named Rusty, keeping a watchful eye on Eliza's progress. "You're doing fine," he encouraged as they crossed a shallow section of the creek. "Just relax and let her pick her way across. She knows what she's doing." The spot he had mentioned turned out to be a small clearing beside a deeper pool where the creek widened before continuing its journey downstream. Ancient oak trees provided dappled shade, and wildflowers dotted the grassy banks with splashes of yellow, blue, and red. "What do you think?" Quentin asked as he helped her dismount, his hands steady at her waist. "Pretty spot, isn't it?" Eliza nodded, taking in the peaceful scene. After tethering the horses where they could graze on the lush grass, Quentin spread a blanket beneath the largest oak tree and produced a small bundle from his saddlebag. "Mrs. Hammond packed us some food," he explained, unwrapping cold chicken, cornbread, and apple tarts. "Hope you don't mind an impromptu picnic." They ate in companionable silence, watching the play of sunlight on the water and listening to the chorus of birdsong from the trees. When they had finished, Quentin leaned back against the trunk of the oak, his expression growing more serious. "I've been wanting to talk to you about something," he said quietly. "About what happened to your family." Eliza stiffened slightly, her eyes widening with alarm. "Please," he said quickly, "hear me out. I wouldn't bring it up if I didn't think it was important." She hesitated, then nodded slowly, wrapping her arms around her knees as if to brace herself. "When I was in Austin before I met you, I heard talk about the attack," he explained, his voice gentle but direct. "The sheriff there had his theories about who was responsible, but no solid proof." Eliza's gaze grew distant, memories of flames and screams threatening to overwhelm her. "While I was in San Antonio finishing up Mr. Hammond's business," Quentin continued, "I heard some things that might be connected. A group of men bragging in a saloon about running small ranchers off their land north of Austin. One of them mentioned a fire that got out of hand." Her breath caught, attention snapping back to him with laser focus. "I didn't approach them directly, thought it better to gather information first," he said. "But I did send a letter to Sheriff Miller with what I learned, including descriptions of the men. He wrote back last week." Quentin reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "He asked me to share this with you when I thought the time was right." With trembling fingers, Eliza accepted the letter. The sheriff's handwriting was cramped, but legible. "Thornton, based on the descriptions you provided, we've identified the men in question as the Radley brothers and their associates. They've been suspected in similar incidents across 3 counties, but always managed to avoid solid evidence tying them to the crimes. Your information, combined with testimony from another victim who recently came forward, has given us enough to make arrests. All 5 men are now in custody awaiting trial for multiple counts of arson, intimidation, and murder. The judge is confident of convictions given the evidence we've assembled. They won't be terrorizing honest folks anymore. Please convey this news to Miss Blackburn when you deem appropriate. Perhaps knowing justice is being served might bring her some measure of peace. Regards, Sheriff J. Miller." Eliza read the letter twice, her hands shaking so badly that the paper rustled. Tears filled her eyes and spilled down her cheeks as the meaning of the words sank in. The men who had destroyed her family, who had haunted her nightmares for months, would face justice for their crimes. "I'm sorry if I've upset you," Quentin said softly, watching her reaction with concern. "I thought you should know." She shook her head vehemently, trying to convey that his apology was unnecessary. Then, acting on impulse, she moved closer and threw her arms around his neck, burying her face against his shoulder as sobs shook her frame. After a moment's surprise, his arms came around her, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other rubbed gentle circles on her back. He held her as she cried, murmuring soothing nonsense and simply offering the comfort of human contact. When her tears finally subsided, Eliza remained in his embrace, drawing strength from his steady presence. She couldn't remember the last time she had allowed herself to be held like this, to be vulnerable without fear. "It's all right," Quentin whispered against her hair. "You're safe now. They can't hurt you or anyone else ever again." Slowly, Eliza pulled back just enough to look up at his face, her own tears stained but calm. Their eyes met and held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then, with deliberate care, Quentin raised one hand to brush a strand of hair from her cheek, his touch feather light. "Eliza," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips. "I care for you. More than I should, perhaps, given how short a time we've known each other. But I want you to know that there's no expectation, no pressure. Your healing is what matters most." She studied his face, the sincere blue eyes, the strong line of his jaw partially hidden by his neat beard, the small scar near his right eyebrow that she had noticed weeks ago but never asked about. In his expression, she saw nothing but honest affection and concern. Drawing a deep breath, Eliza did something she hadn't done since the night of the fire. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse but audible in the quiet clearing. Quentin's eyes widened in astonishment, joy blooming across his features like sunrise. "Eliza," he breathed, clearly struggling to find words. She smiled through fresh tears, this time of release rather than grief. "For everything," she added, each word easier than the last, as if her voice was a muscle slowly remembering how to work. With wonder in his eyes, Quentin raised his hand to cup her cheek, his thumb gently brushing away a tear. "May I kiss you?" he asked softly. In answer, she leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle and undemanding, a promise rather than a claim. Eliza felt something long frozen within her begin to thaw, like ice breaking up on a river at the first true warmth of spring. When they parted, Quentin rested his forehead against hers, his expression one of mingled joy and disbelief. "I never expected," he began, then shook his head slightly. I hoped, but—" "I know," she said simply, savoring the feeling of words forming in her throat, on her tongue, between her lips. Speaking felt strange after so many months of silence, but also right, as if she had finally reclaimed a part of herself that had been stolen. They stayed in the clearing until the sun began to dip toward the western horizon, talking quietly. Eliza's voice grew stronger with use, though she still spoke sparingly, choosing her words with care. She told Quentin about her parents, how her father had taught her to fish in the creek near their ranch, how her mother had sung old folk songs while kneading bread, how they had built their modest home board by board with their own hands. In turn, he shared memories of his own family, his mother's talent for storytelling, his father's patient lessons in horsemanship, the sister who had moved to California after marrying a gold prospector. As the shadows lengthened, they reluctantly packed up the remains of their picnic and mounted their horses for the ride back to the ranch. Quentin reached across the space between them to squeeze Eliza's hand gently. "Whatever happens next," he said, "know that I'm here for as long as you want me to be." She returned the pressure of his fingers, a smile lighting her eyes. "I want you to be," she replied softly. Their return to the ranch caused something of a sensation when Eliza answered Mrs. Hammond's greeting with a quiet "thank you" instead of her usual nod. The older woman's eyes filled with happy tears, and she immediately called for her husband to witness the miracle. "My dear girl," Mrs. Hammond said, embracing Eliza warmly. "What wonderful progress! Was it the ride that did it?" Or she glanced between Eliza and Quentin, noting their clasped hands and flushed faces, and smiled knowingly. "Ah, I see. Well, love has been known to work wonders where medicine fails." Mr. Hammond cleared his throat gruffly, though his eyes betrayed his own pleasure at the development. "This calls for a celebration," he announced. "Martha, tell cook to prepare something special for dinner tonight." That evening, seated around the dining table with the Hammonds and Quentin, who had been invited to join them for the occasion, Eliza found herself enveloped in a warmth that went beyond the warmth of being among people who genuinely cared for her well-being and rejoiced in her healing. "A toast," Mr. Hammond said, raising his glass, "to new beginnings and found voices." As glasses clinked and smiles were exchanged, Eliza caught Quentin's gaze across the table. The tenderness in his eyes made her heart skip a beat, and she knew with sudden clarity that her life had reached a turning point, that the path ahead, while not free of shadows from the past, held the promise of light and love she had thought forever lost. In the weeks that followed, Eliza's voice grew stronger, though she remained selective with her words, speaking when she had something meaningful to say rather than filling silence for its own sake. Her nightmares grew less frequent, and when they did come, she found comfort in the knowledge that the men responsible were facing justice for their crimes. Her relationship with Quentin deepened gradually, built on the foundation of trust and understanding they had established during her months of silence. They spent every Sunday together, sometimes riding out to explore the vast ranchlands, sometimes simply sitting on the porch swing talking quietly about their hopes and dreams. One evening in late June, as they watched fireflies rising from the tall grass beyond the garden, Quentin took her hand in his expression unusually serious. "Eliza," he began, his voice carrying a hint of nervous tension she rarely heard from him, "there's something I need to tell you." Her heart quickened at his tone. "What is it?" "I've been saving money for years," he said, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of her hand, "putting aside as much as I could from every paycheck. Last week, I heard about a small piece of land for sale about 10 miles from here, 100 acres with good water and decent grazing." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "I made an offer, and it was accepted. It's nothing fancy, just a small cabin that needs work and enough land to start a modest herd, but it's a beginning. My beginning." Eliza squeezed his hand, happiness blooming in her chest at the pride in his voice. "That's wonderful news, Quentin. Your own ranch at last." "That's the thing," he continued, his blue eyes intense in the fading light. "I don't want it to be just my ranch. I want it to be our ranch." Her breath caught as he slid from the swing to kneel before her, still holding her hand in his. "Eliza Blackburn," he said softly, "I know we haven't known each other long in the counting of months, but in all the ways that matter, I feel I've known you a lifetime. You're the bravest, strongest woman I've ever met, and I love you with everything I am." From his pocket, he withdrew a small ring, a simple gold band set with a modest pearl. "This was my mother's," he explained. "I've carried it with me since she died, waiting for the day I'd find someone who embodied her strength and kindness." He held the ring up, his expression earnest and vulnerable. "Would you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife, of building a life together on land that belongs to both of us?" tears welled in Eliza's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. The past months had taught her that grief and happiness could coexist, that new beginnings didn't erase what came before but built upon it, creating something different but no less valuable. "Yes," she whispered, then louder with growing conviction. "Yes, I will marry you, Quentin Thornton." His face lit with such radiant joy that it nearly took her breath away. He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been made for her, then rose to take her in his arms, kissing her with tender passion that promised a lifetime of love. The Hammonds were delighted by the news, Mrs. Hammond immediately offering to host the wedding at Triple Creek, and Mr. Hammond gruffly declaring that the newlyweds could continue to live on the ranch until their own home was ready. "Consider it our wedding gift," he told them when Quentin tried to protest. "You've been the best foreman this ranch has seen, Thornton. Least we can do is help you get started on your own place." Even Aunt Beatrice, when informed of the engagement via letter, responded with cautious approval, noting that she would attend the wedding to ensure all is proper, but acknowledging that Quentin seemed to be a steady sort of man, if somewhat lacking in social position. The wedding took place on a perfect September day, with the hills around Triple Creek painted in the golden hues of early autumn. Eliza wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Hammond had helped her make, adorned with lace saved from the older woman's own wedding gown. Wildflowers from the ranch lands formed her bouquet and crown, and her honey-brown hair fell in loose curls down her back. Quentin waited for her beneath an arch of twisted branches and flowers, his expression transforming from nervous anticipation to wonder as she walked toward him on Mr. Hammond's arm. He had never looked more handsome, dressed in a new black suit with his hair neatly trimmed and his beard groomed to perfection. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, attended by the Hammonds, the ranch hands who had become like family, Aunt Beatrice, who sniffed disapprovingly at the outdoor setting but seemed touched by the obvious love between the couple, and even Sheriff Miller, who had traveled from Austin to witness the union of the silent girl he had once worried over and the steady cowboy who had helped her find her voice again. When asked to speak her vows, Eliza's voice rang out clear and strong, carrying across the assembled guests without hesitation or fear. "I, Eliza Blackburn, take you, Quentin Thornton, to be my husband, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do us part." Quentin's eyes shone with unshed tears as he repeated the same vows, his deep voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, his kiss was both tender and passionate, a promise of all they would build together in the years to come. The celebration continued well into the evening, with food and music and dancing under the stars. As the night deepened, the newlyweds slipped away to the small cabin that had been prepared for them at the edge of the ranch compound, a temporary home, until their own place was ready. Later, as they lay entwined in the quiet darkness, Quentin traced gentle patterns on Eliza's bare shoulder, his voice soft with wonder. "I never thought I could be this happy," he confessed. "When I agreed to escort a silent, traumatized girl to San Antonio, I was just doing what seemed right. I had no idea she would become the center of my world." Eliza raised herself on one elbow to look down at him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through the window. "And I never thought I would speak again, let alone love again," she replied, bending to press a kiss to his lips. "You gave me back my voice by never demanding I use it. You gave me back my heart by showing me it was still capable of feeling something besides grief." His arms tightened around her, pulling her closer. "We'll build something good together," he promised. "A home, a ranch, A family, whatever you want, Eliza. We have time now. All the time in the world. Over the next year, they divided their time between working at Triple Creek and building up their own small ranch, which they named New Dawn. The cabin there was gradually expanded and improved, with Quentin adding a proper bedroom, a larger kitchen, and a covered porch where Eliza liked to sit in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and pink. They started with a small herd, just 20 head of cattle and 2 good horses, but with hard work and careful management, the operation began to thrive. Eliza proved to have a natural head for business, keeping meticulous records and suggesting innovations that increased their productivity. Quentin often joked that he'd married not just a beautiful woman, but the best business partner a rancher could ask for. In the spring of their second year of marriage, as wildflowers carpeted the hills around New Dawn Ranch in a riot of color, Eliza shared news that brought tears of joy to Quentin's eyes. They would be welcoming a child before the year was out. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, with Mrs. Hammond providing experienced advice and Quentin hovering protectively, insisting that Eliza rest more and lift less. She tolerated his fussing with good-natured amusement, knowing it stemmed from love rather than doubt in her capabilities. On a crisp December morning in 1878, after a long but uncomplicated labor, Eliza gave birth to a healthy son whom they named Jonathan Robert Thornton, Jonathan after her father, and Robert after Mr. Hammond, who had become like a father to them both. As she watched Quentin hold their son for the first time, his strong hands incredibly gentle with the tiny bundle, his blue eyes filled with wonder and love, Eliza felt a sense of completion she had once thought forever beyond her reach. "He's perfect," Quentin whispered, carefully returning the baby to her arms, "just like his mother." Eliza smiled up at her husband, reaching to touch his bearded cheek. "He'll grow up strong and kind like his father," she replied, her voice still the most precious gift she could offer, words chosen with care and spoken with meaning. Life at New Dawn Ranch settled into a rhythm of hard work and simple joys as the years passed. The herd grew, the house expanded to accommodate their growing family, and the land responded to their careful stewardship with increasing bounty. When Jonathan was 3, a daughter joined the family, Mary Margaret Thornton, named for both grandmothers she would never meet but whose stories she would grow up hearing. Through it all, the long days of ranch work, the sleepless nights with colicky babies, the lean times when drought threatened their livelihood, the prosperous seasons when everything seemed to flourish, Eliza and Quentin maintained the deep connection that had formed when she was still shrouded in silence, and he had spoken softly enough to reach her through her grief. On their 10th wedding anniversary, after the children had been put to bed with stories of cowboys and brave pioneer women, Eliza and Quentin sat together on the porch swing he had built when she was pregnant with Jonathan. The night was clear, stars scattered across the velvet black Texas sky like diamonds, a cool breeze carrying the scent of sage and cattle and home. 10 years, Quentin mused, his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close against his side. "Sometimes it feels like we just met yesterday, and other times I can't remember what life was like before you." Eliza leaned her head on his shoulder, her hand finding his in the darkness. "You ever wonder what would have happened if Sheriff Miller hadn't asked you to escort me to San Antonio?" "I've thought about it," he admitted, pressing a kiss to her temple. "But I like to think we would have found each other somehow, some way, like we were meant to be, no matter what path we took." She smiled at the sentiment, so characteristic of the man who had won her heart with his steady presence and gentle words. "You know, I've never properly thanked Sheriff Miller for asking you." "No time like the present," Quentin said with a chuckle. We could write to him tomorrow." "Maybe we will," Eliza agreed, tilting her face up for his kiss. "But right now, I can think of better ways to celebrate 10 years together." As he gathered her into his arms with a smile that still made her heart skip a beat, Eliza reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from the ashes of her family home to the thriving ranch they had built together, from her months of traumatized silence to the confident voice with which she now spoke her mind and heart, from two wounded souls seeking solace to the strong partnership they had forged through love and determination. Her voice had been silenced by trauma, but a cowboy who spoke softly had helped her find words again, and in doing so, had given her a new story to tell, a new life to live, a love that had healed them both in ways neither could have imagined that day in Austin when they first met. And that, Eliza thought as she led her husband into the home they had built with their own hands, was the most beautiful story of all, one that continued to unfold with each passing day, each spoken word, each moment of the life they shared.